Who is James Joyce?
Irish,
Okay.
an author. Male.
What is your most memorable experience with Joyce ever in your life?
Um, I would say like, I guess the two that come to mind are like the Bloomsday thing, because
Mhm.
that was like, I don't drink very much, if ever. I don't even think I drank at that event actually, to be honest, but
Had a
I
vibe. It had a
certainly,
drinking vibe.
yeah, I vibed. I drank my water. I pretended it was something that was drinky. Um, and it was fun. And then we went to a bookstore after, and I made a lot of people uncomfortable, and that was pretty poggies, I think, pretty
Hey,
funny,
I think it's
pretty
very,
humorous.
in Joyce's style. It's an homage to
Yeah.
him as a person who makes other people uncomfortable.
So I guess my best memory of James Joyce was going to an Irish pub, having not read any James Joyce,
Okay.
um, and being surrounded by people drinking to James Joyce, and then going to a bookstore shortly thereafter and making people uncomfortable.
For a fact that you two have read James Joyce's short story Evelyn because we read it in high school.
That was James Joyce. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, this is interesting. Why? Like,
Wait,
do
which
you
one
remember
was
that
that?
story at
Is
all?
that the one with like the corpse in the attic?
Oh no, that's
No,
Roses for
that's
Emily or something
yes,
like
my
that.
bad. That's a different E name.
Yeah.
Evelyn,
Evelyn
okay,
is the one
no,
where
that's
it's
the
just
one with the
like,
boat, right? She's just leaving or whatever,
yeah,
or
she's
running
like
away.
going to
Okay,
leave,
I
but then
got it.
she doesn't leave.
And then oh, I forgot about that part. I totally
Dang.
thought she ran away.
Okay. So that's the only Joyce you've read?
Yeah, and I really had to
Interesting.
pull it out of my memory there.
Yeah, I did it for you. Why? Why don't you think you've read more Joyce?
Uh, because I'm an adult and I'm busy. Not saying that like that
Mhm.
that was a horrible way to word that.
No, no,
That
no,
made
I
it
get
sound
it.
like reading is like not an adult thing. Um, I just like I have like my days are full. I from like 9 a.m. to late in the day. I'm like
Mhm.
still finishing my classes and like rehearsals and
Mm,
going to the gym now, even though it's horrible, but I'm doing it anyway.
good.
And like going to the gym and working because I have a job and all this stuff.
Mhm.
So I think it's just I don't really have. I mean, I can't even get through. I have like my collection of mystery books over there that I have barely touched because um, I don't have time. I wish I
Okay.
did. I just don't.
That's okay, yeah. So then in here, I'm very excited to hear your answers then. As someone who has like technically read one of James Joyce's short stories, but didn't really remember it. And also that
I'm
was like
sorry.
8 years ago. No, but like, so we've set the stage now. So for you, as the sort of person who has that relationship with Joyce, who is James Joyce?
Irish,
Okay.
an author. Male. um, that's really all I know. And then I think you've told me he was very sexually charged in his writing, or maybe it was the opposite. Maybe he is not at all sexually
No,
charged.
he was no. There's lots of sexiness. What did he write? Do you know any of the titles of his works beyond the one with the E name?
Damn it. No, I'm sure if you named a couple, I'd be like, ah, I've heard of that one,
Mhm.
but I
Why do
don't
you
think I
think?
could actually
Why do you think that
anymore.
is that you have this sort of like you would have this ambient knowledge where you're like sure that you've heard of Joyce, but you don't connect it with him?
Probably because he's famous in a field that I like don't know. Like I was
Mm-hmm.
actually, this is kind of because the Olympics are going on right now.
Mm-hmm.
So my family has been watching like some of the Olympics, and I walked by and I just kind of made a comment. I'm like, it's kind of because to me, like when I as a music person,
Mm-hmm.
I sit there and I'm like, Christian McBride, yo, and I like freak out over all these musicians that no one has any who no like bass players maybe might know who Christian McBride is, but like who he's not like a household name or anything. And I was
Mm-hmm.
walking by and my parents were watching the Olympics and I was like, it's kind of crazy to me that like these people are like legends in their field, and there's just this entire community of people that like love to talk about these people, and I just don't know anything about them other than that they have their name in the lower third of the screen. And that they are a luge person. But there's a whole entire community of luge people that talk about them. They're like, whoa, that person's insane. I can't believe like people don't bleh. But so I think it's the same here, where it's like, you know, it's just not a field I'm in, like as involved in. So people in the community, I'm sure, are like, I freaking love James Joyce. James Joyce, oh my God. Like they're freaking out about him. And I'm just like, yeah, I speak English as well.
Do you have any impressions of Joyce without having read much of his work apart from like the sexy times?
I mean, I would say my one impression of him before like this whole interview was in high school. I guess it was when we were reading Evelyn, because it was a James Joyce thing. And our teacher, Mrs. Seuss, hello,
Shout out Mrs.
please sponsor
Seuss.
us.
Hey.
Shout out Mrs. Seuss, sponsor us. Lots of sponsors on this stream right now.
For my 5 subscribers.
But she made a comment before we started reading Evelyn. I forget exactly how it went, but it was like, it was either just straight up, I don't really like James Joyce, I find him boring, or it was, you're going to find James Joyce really boring, and then you're going to come around and realize he's really good, or it's going to be, or something like that. She was either full on, I find James Joyce really boring, or he's an acquired taste. It was one of those, and my brain doesn't fully remember, but I just distinctly remember Mrs. Seuss being like, he's either just full out boring or he starts out boring.
I remember too, in high school, I hated Joyce. Like, I thought his work made no sense. It was such a waste of time. I had tried reading Ulysses, and like, he was raised like in the Jesuit tradition, which is like Catholic. And I remember I would have to like, I was like, so I had to like go and ask theological stuff to try to understand like what Joyce was saying. I just hated it. It was like way too much work that it was, you know what I mean? And I feel like that did partially come from like, I remember that first impression too of like, oh, I feel like she said the acquired taste thing where she was like, I still haven't acquired it yet, but like I've heard that you can.
I think that was it. I still haven't acquired it yet. It was just like, she's like, I still don't get it, but he's good.
Some people do. Yeah. And so I remember being like, no, like if she hasn't acquired it, then I don't need to either. I'm just wondering if you've had any other experiences where like it doesn't have to be something that was like as set up as Bloomsday, clearly like Joy, but just like if you've had any other run-ins in your life where you're like, oh dang, that's James Joyce.
I guess there was that one conversation, that one really long conversation we had like behind the field, behind like the like former high school, I guess now middle school, where you were just talking about your masters and like being a professor and all that. That was that was a good day, let me tell you. We talked about like how you wanted to like analyze like James Joyce asexually or something along those lines. And I don't know if that's still your project, but that was like the idea you had. And then we talked about his big sexy energy for a real long time. And what are other, because I feel like if you said some book titles, I would know at least of his it's not discography, that's the music thing,
bibliography.
But his discography, thank you, bibliography of books. So what are some other James Joyce books that I can look at?
Yeah, so I feel like the best one to start with, that everyone, I think most people who manage to get into Joyce end up starting with Dubliners, which is a collection of short stories. Evelyn is one of them.
We did, you know what? We did see Dubliners at the bookstore one day.
Has 15 short stories, though. Evelyn's one of them. The most famous one from that is The Dead, is like the final short story in there. So some people are really, yeah, it's so good. I cry at the end every time.
Sounds
And
like
then,
someone dies.
well, they're dead already by the beginning of the story. Spoiler
Oh
alert,
shit.
spoiler
Speed
alert.
dating for ghosts. Oh my god.
The next one that he wrote was a like shorter novel called A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Ooh. And that's the one that got me into Joyce because it's just like so much like sort of that like it's all about Stephen Dedalus, who is essentially just like James Joyce as a character. um, and yeah, I don't know. It's him from like infancy up to sort of like first couple years of university. And I read it in my like first couple years of university. And I was like, this is me. Wow.
I am an artist as a young man.
I am. I'm a portrait of the artist as a young man. And then there's Ulysses, which starts with Stephen, but then it kind of like moves to another character called Leopold Bloom, hence Bloom's Day. And then his like final major work is this insane, I wouldn't even call it a novel. It's a book called Finnegans Wake that's like
I
written in
have
the
heard of
language.
Finnegans Wake.
Oh, interesting. What do you know about Finnegans Wake?
Absolutely nothing.
Okay. It's a wild ride. I'm about 150 pages from the end for the first time, but the thing is, it's like written in a circle, if that makes sense. And it's like not really English. It's written
It's
in
like a
like
time loop.
dream, like yeah, well, sort of, but it's like written in like dream language. So there's no like, or there's very few like recognizable English words. So you have to like read it aloud, and it's more just like sounds and like a vibe, and like I don't know, it's nuts.
It's the soundscape of novels. It's the
Yeah,
soundscaping of novels.
exactly so. But yeah, so those are kind of his like four major works. He also like wrote a play and some poems. I really enjoy the play. It's called Exiles. I think it deserves more attention. But the poems, I think most people are like, no. Glad he got into prose. So those are his major works that you might wanna check
Maybe I
out.
will read Finnegans Wake because the fact that it's artsy and weird kind of interests me. I just bought House of Leaves actually by Mark something or other.
Mhm,
Is it over on this shelf? It is not. It's probably over there.
mhm.
But House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. Hello, I haven't read your book yet, but I brought it many years ago. And I shout out to you for writing a cool novel that I haven't read. Um, but yeah, it kind of sounds like that because that one has a lot of like pages that are like, oh, this page is just upside down.
Wow, interesting.
Page is just written in a spiral, I guess. And it's weird apparently. And then I guess my other question would
Mhm.
be, what is your project again? Like, why are we doing this? I know I
Yeah,
agreed to do this, but
no,
why
that's
have I agreed?
so I'm in a public scholarship course this semester, and basically what we're sort of like the overall purpose of the course, as I understand it, is sort of like how can we bridge like between the work that we do in the academy and because we see and we study how that affects people outside of the academy. But I think we've up to date done like not a great job of actually like making people outside of the academy like aware of why our work is useful and how our work affects them and like why they should support our work and like how their lives and how their knowledge can and does like influence work within the academy. So it's essentially just like recognizing that the humanities and like literary studies and that sort of thing requires this bridge between the academy and the more like public sphere of people, like not basically people who aren't graduate students in English.
Yeah.
So for our final project, it was basically just like, hey, do some public scholarship. And I think a lot of times the first sort of like the first instinct is like, oh, well, I'm a scholar, I have all this knowledge, I want to go like share it with the world. But that can, in my opinion, that can kind of lead to being like this like condescending tone or like almost paternalistic, like, oh, ho,
Relatable.
ho. Yeah, like, oh, I've paid tens of thousands of dollars
I
to be
do
in the
that and I know
academy.
when I am doing it, but I can't stop
Like,
myself because I just get too excited.
dang, that's okay. But yeah, so I think like the point of my project is to sort of like do the opposite, where instead of it being like me as like a representative of the academy, like going out to my public and saying like, hey, this is how Joyce affects you. I'm more like creating this stage for like people who are a part of my public to like say how Joyce has affected them. So kind of like building the bridge in the opposite direction that we usually
Yeah,
do.
that's kind of the same as like music stuff, like relating it back
Mhm.
to myself.
Mhm.
I mean, I think there is a lot of like society, like there, I think the difference between yours and mine is that societally speaking, there is still like this gap between like people realizing how necessary like music or English or any of the humanitarian like arts and that kind of thing.
Mhm.
There is a bridge of like society, like it's kind of the first thing the budget goes and kicks away kind of thing,
Mhm.
right? It's like fine arts.
Yeah.
um so I feel that part. I think the part that's like different is you don't really like, there is definitely like an academic music thing. And like I said, I am definitely someone who can get a little bit too excited and talk about music in a way that may off-put other people, because it turns into just mansplaining, and I every time after I'm like, why the frick did I do that? But I do it anyway because I get excited and I don't realize in the moment that that's what I'm doing. Um, but I think the difference is that uh, music is like more like the general public still can enjoy it in some capacity and just talk about like, hey, this is my favorite song. There isn't really a good reason other than I like the sound of it.
Mhm.
Where it is definitely much harder to access James Joyce literature and
Yeah.
enjoy it in a certain capacity. I mean, there's certainly music out there. It's like I'm not gonna go up to someone and be like, "Listen to this Schoenberg, like J. Klavierstück." That was really awful German, I assume. But no one's ever gonna want to listen to 12-tone music if I walk up to them and be like, "This is so cool," and then it's just like banging on the keyboard. Everyone's like, "I hate it." Um, but my point being,
Mhm.
there is much more accessible
Mm.
people. Like music is just very accessible for people, whereas I feel like this kind of like classic literature is much harder to access for
Okay.
people, and that is where the difference lies. But I understand where you're coming from with the wow, like society really do just kind of be like, let's cut the budget on all of these things
Mhm.
that are necessary, but they don't realize, but people don't realize it is.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like from what I understand anyway, like the idea of public scholarship is kind of this like hopeful anyway, sort of like recognition that or like not like an owning a bit of like maybe people don't understand because I think it's really easy to fall into that pious trap of like, oh well, I'm a literary scholar, so I know why it's important, and it just is like you have to trust me because I've studied it. And I
Yeah,
think eventually we have to sort of like own up and be like, maybe the reason that people don't think this is important and the reason that people cut our budgets is because we haven't properly communicated to them why it's important. If there's anything that will stand out to you as memorable about this conversation that we had and all of the parasocial relationships we created through it. But is there anything that, you know,
with
what's
five
your like
other people.
us and the five other people who watch this?
Yeah, I think like I definitely want to check out like Finnegans Wake now. Just the way you described it to me is sounds really interesting to me. As someone who do be like, wow, soundscape, that just noise, very music to my ears. Um,
Hey.
so I'll probably check out Finnegans Wake just because of that kind of like love of soundscapey stuff in word form. Um, so definitely check out that book. Um, I find it kind of interesting how, just the whole point of this project, I think is a really interesting takeaway, like, especially for me, like, as someone who doesn't really read a whole lot of classic literature,
Mhm.
or literature at all. That'll probably be the part that I pull away from this the most, because I definitely feel that, where it's like, I can feel like the academic part of me, like pulling out and making music unintentionally less accessible to people,
Mhm.
um like uh in that way. So I think that'll be the one I definitely take away the most from it because I don't want to do that. I want people to enjoy music, much like how you want people to enjoy James Joyce. So that is probably my biggest takeaway is think about how me as an academic and the academia can make our respective fields more accessible to the people.